You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. You've probably heard the term microplastics, and you probably also heard that they're bad for you. A write-up from Stanford Medicine says, quote, "They're in the water we drink, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, and the air we breathe." But what exactly are they, and how bad are they for us? The term has been around since 2004, so maybe you already know. But if I'm being honest, I don't think I know enough. And I'd like to be a little more informed about these tiny particles that are supposedly bad for my health and what I can do to avoid them. Here to help us be more informed is Dr. Sheela Sathyanarayana, a professor of pediatrics and adjunct professor of environmental and occupational health sciences at the University of Washington and Seattle Children's Research Institute. Doctor, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So just to orient ourselves here, what are microplastics? How do you explain them to patients?
Yeah, they're small particles that are less than 5 millimeters in diameter. And so you can actually visualize them. That might be something similar to a seed, like a sesame seed. So they're very small particles. And then there are also nanoparticles that are even smaller and not visible to the eye.
So they can actually be both visible and invisible.
Microplastics can be visible, and then nanoplastics are invisible.
Where do they come from?
So they come from so many different sources in our daily lives. I think it's really hard to go a day in our life without using plastic. It's really revolutionized what we can do in our daily lives. But the other side of that is that we are exposed to plastics a lot in so many different ways. So some examples are through the food supply. And that's because the more processed a food is, the more likely it is to touch plastic in so many different ways before it gets to your plate. It can be in terms of the air, there can be air pollution that you inhale. And then sometimes there's dermal exposure as well, which is on the skin from personal care products. And then I'm a healthcare provider. And so one of the things that we worry about is also plastic exposure in the hospital, and certainly from IV bags and things like that.
So that would be like an intravenous exposure?
It would.
Wow. So absorbing through the skin, breathing through the air, ingesting through our food that we take in. I mean, is it safe to say that these things could be, we could be exposed to them all day long, all the time?
I think it is safe to say that. I think probably the two most important routes of exposure are through food and ingestion, as well as inhalation. And even through inhalation, that's a pretty big particle to inhale. I think if you inhaled something that was 5 millimeters, you would probably really notice it. But sometimes if you're in industrial areas or areas that are highly polluted, that can happen. So food might be the easiest source to focus on.
And I don't have to be a doctor to know that it's not great to be taking in all this plastic all the time, the different sources, from various parts of our lives. But I think that there's a lot of fear right now out there about what microplastics are and what they do to us. And maybe a lot of question marks about, really their impact in our bodies. What do we reliably know about how microplastics affect our health?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is we don't know a lot. What we do know a lot about are some of the chemicals that come from plastics. And that's what I've studied in my own lab and over the course of my career for many, many years. There are a number of chemicals that are in plastic matrices, and they can be toxic in the body. People may have heard of them. Some of them are called phthalates, some of them are called bisphenols. And those chemicals can leach from the plastic into your body and cause direct harm. Now, that's different from these actual particles, some of which could be inert, which means that they just get into your body and stay there and they don't cause any harm beyond that. And Some of them could be more harmful than that. And I think that that's what we'll learn more about in the future. But what we know right now is that the most harmful components from plastics are some of the chemicals that can leach into your body. And not all plastics have those chemicals.
Wow. You are a pediatrician by training, and this is something that is an exposure risk for even tiny babies, right? What do we know about how even kids, who are not born yet may be exposed to these microplastics?
Yeah. So what we know is that pregnant women can be exposed to microplastics and they can pass through the placenta and potentially affect fetal development. We also know that the chemicals that come from these plastics can pass through the placenta and affect development. And so that's one way in which the unborn child could be affected. Also, as infants develop and grow, I think any parent knows that there is a phase where infants put every single thing in their mouths. It's how they're interacting with their environment. And we also know that infants consume a lot more dust than we do as adults. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, estimates that infants take in about 30 grams of dust a day, which is actually quite a big amount. And a lot of that is likely plastic dust, given the components that they're exposed to.
Wow. Uh, so, with all of these potential places where we're breathing or taking in microplastics, and even babies are, what do we do to avoid it? I mean, we don't know the full effects of this stuff in our bodies, but I think most people can say, I'd rather not find out the hard way. So, what do you think are the best ways to limit your exposure?
Yeah, I think by far some of the best ways to limit exposure are to focus on a diet that is made of fresh and frozen foods. So you literally are taking a whole food from the grocery store and preparing it yourself and then eating it and consuming it. And therefore, you know that there are likely no plastic components, in those foods. Can you do that for all of your food? Absolutely not. But that is one way in which you can reduce exposures to try to reduce your consumption, especially of processed foods. In terms of your water, I've focused on food, but I include water in that as well. Basically, anything you're consuming. There are filters that can filter out these particles, and any basic filter, water filter you have will filter out microplastics pretty well. But if you're using a plastic filter, you still have potentially some plastic exposure there from the filter itself. So some people like to use the Berkey. That's kind of a different kind of filter that doesn't have plastic in it. And then other people sometimes use under the sink water filtration, which is a little bit more expensive, but also is effective.
Do you
And
think, specifically for pregnant women, that this is a bigger concern, or is this something that everybody might potentially want to explore?
I think that pregnant women are extremely vulnerable because they are trying to support this developing fetus and have a healthy baby that has the best chance of normal development and growth over time. So I do think that pregnant women and young children are probably the most likely to be impacted, but everyone can certainly use these same tips to reduce their exposures. And we also in the health realm kind of talk about different life stages that may be important. And there's certain life stages where things really change. And puberty is one of them. For women, certainly menopause, and men, andropause is another time period. And those time periods may also be very important for these exposures. There were a couple of other things that I wanted to mention in terms of how to reduce exposure. So we talked about food. I would say also just removing your shoes when you enter your home and keeping dust off the windowsills and floors. And if you're able to, you can have an air filter inside your home. Any basic air filter will reduce these particles in the air.
What about my kitchen equipment? This has become a big conversation around my family and friends, where some of us have been like throwing out everything that's black plastic in our, kitchen equipment, because we've had some articles that have come out where people say, well, this recycled material, it degrades more easily. It's made from more chemicals than other plastics. Other people are really obsessed with going with all wood cutting boards now because the plastic cutting boards might be a source. There are conversations about takeout containers, things like that. I know it's hard to say, yes, we should be throwing all this stuff out, but in your own life, have you limited the plastic in your kitchen?
Yes, we have eliminated all of our plastic cookware and nonstick cookware. And so everything that we use to heat foods and water and liquids is non-plastic. And also all of our implements that we use are non-plastic as well. So the tongs are metal, or a stirring spoon is wooden. There is a balance between waste, ecological waste, and as well as trying to protect your own health. And so we still do have some old plastic containers where we store things. They're completely clean, but we don't heat those containers, nor do we wash them all the time so as to not prevent degradation of the plastic. So I think it's more about how you use those things. So in general, if you don't heat your plastics and you keep them relatively clean, they shouldn't degrade over time. And certainly there's different kinds of plastic that degrade more easily than others, and people probably see that in their daily lives. But takeout containers particularly can contain a lining that often has chemicals that are sometimes called forever chemicals, like PFAS chemicals. And while those are not specifically directly related to microplastics, they can be in plastics as well. So trying to avoid those takeout containers when you can is great.
I know this is a big question, but I kind of just think back to my childhood in the 80s and 90s, and everything I used, everything I ate off of, all my toys, everything was plastic all the time. It was a plastic childhood. 80s and 90s, we didn't think about this stuff. And I wonder, are we going to ever, doctor, look back on the years of plastic the way that we look back on lead exposure, like in the middle of the 20th century, where we now know that there were all of these serious consequences of lead in the air and lead in our homes, where you saw neurological development issues, all these different issues that, we learned about later, and then required a lot of environmental regulation and regulation around what kind of paints we use and substances in our homes and workplaces. I am not saying that there is a direct link between the plastic you have in a, kiddie sippy cup and the kind of harm caused by lead in the 1950s in America. But do you think that we will ever be in a place where we're looking back and just shaking our heads and thinking, my God, those people at the turn of the century exposed to so much plastic, how could they not have known?
I think that we're running a very large experiment on our population by having unregulated chemicals in our everyday lives and in our food supply specifically. And we do know that the rates of chronic disease have skyrocketed in our population. And that can't all be attributed to lifestyle changes. And I think that there is ample evidence to show that these chemicals certainly have toxicity. What we will find out and learn about microplastics remains to be determined. But I think that there's enough evidence right now to really try to limit your exposure to some of these chemicals that we already have strong research on.
Is there anything else that you want to leave people with? Again, I don't want to have everybody scared and immediately upending their kitchens or anything, but this has become such a big conversation. Everybody I know, we just sort of have like a gallows humor sense about, well, we're all filled with microplastics anyway, so what does anything matter? Do you want to leave any final thought for folks who are really concerned about this, freaked out?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. One is that there is a difference between the actual plastic particles and the chemicals themselves. And I think one of the things that I don't hear in this conversation are nanoplastics as drug delivery mechanisms. So nanoplastics have been used to deliver drugs to tissues that are hard to get to for a long, long time now. And they provide significant benefit, especially when you think of someone undergoing cancer chemotherapy and things like that. I think that we know some health impacts from the chemicals from plastics, and we also know some benefits from some of these very, very small plastic particles. In terms of the microplastics themselves, one of the ways in which I try to describe it to people is maybe something like a splinter. You get this underneath your skin, it's irritating. It could lead to infection, it could lead to other harms, or it might not. And I think that's how people should kind of think about it, is that right now we really don't know what the actual particle itself is doing unless we know that there are chemicals associated with it, which is what I have worked on for many years. One other thing I would like to leave people with, especially women of reproductive age who may be really worried about these things, is that I really want to try to reduce fear. People really do have more control over their exposures than I think they do. So, two key pieces of information. One, none of us are going to get to zero exposure with any microplastic or chemical. And that is just a product of being in our industrialized world. So, don't beat yourself up if you can't follow all the guidelines all the time. No one can do that. I can't do that either. And two, there are some really simple ways to really try to reduce your plastic exposure in your life. Just switching out all of your food and water and beverage kind of containers and keeping your Tupperware glass or stainless steel, as they do in many other countries, are other ways. So I do think that the guidance here can really help.
The cost is also a factor, right? It's so interesting when you see in the grocery aisle, for example, if you go to a fancy store right now, there are French brands of yogurt you can buy that are sold in ceramic packages, like a disposable ceramic that is you can purchase yogurt in, which is like, to me, seems so crazy, but I'm sure in Europe is more common. But again, it's at the fancy grocery store and it's way more expensive than your average cup of Yoplait. Anyway, this is just such a fascinating conversation, and I hope that we can keep having it, keep up on these issues as, again, it's got a lot of people concerned, but I think, as you say, it's not about fear, it's about how can we control things and what can we do in our own lives. Dr. Sheela Sathyanarayana is a professor of pediatrics and adjunct professor of environmental and occupational health sciences at the University of Washington and associate center director for the Center of Health Behavior and Development at Seattle Children's Research Institute. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.